Imagine waking up in ancient Rome, knowing that your body is your most valuable possession. Not because you own it, but because someone else does. You are a gladiator. And today, thousands of people are going to pay to watch you risk your life. The strange thing is that being a gladiator wasn't simply about fighting. It was a business, a massive one. Behind every fight was money. Someone paid for your training. Someone fed you. Someone maintained the arena. Someone organized the event. Someone sold the tickets. And somewhere above all of them, an emperor or wealthy politician was using the spectacle to gain something even more valuable than money: power. So what was the economics of actually being a Roman gladiator? And could a gladiator become rich? The answer is much more complicated than you might expect. Let's start with how you became one. For many gladiators, the story began with slavery. A captured enemy soldier, a prisoner of war, or an enslaved person could be sold to a gladiator owner, known as a Lanista. The Lanista wasn't simply buying a fighter, he was buying an investment. Because turning an ordinary slave into a professional gladiator wasn't cheap. You needed food, training, medical care, weapons, armor, a place to sleep, and experienced trainers who knew how to keep fighters alive long enough to make money from them. A badly trained gladiator was basically a destroyed investment. If he died in his first fight, the owner lost everything that had been spent preparing him. So the goal wasn't necessarily to kill, it was to create a fighter who could survive, again and again. Think of a gladiator like an extremely dangerous piece of property. The more skilled he became, the more valuable he was. And that created an unusual economic relationship. A gladiator's greatest financial asset was his body. But keeping that body alive was also a business expense. This is where the gladiator school became important. Gladiators were trained in specialized facilities called ludi. Inside, they exercised, practiced fighting techniques, learned different weapons, and prepared for the arena. And surprisingly, their diet wasn't what Hollywood usually shows us. They needed calories, lots of them. Gladiators had to train constantly, so their diet was designed to keep them strong and healthy. Sources suggest that their meals often relied heavily on grains and legumes, with foods such as barley and beans playing an important role. This gave them plenty of energy. But it also had another advantage. It was relatively cheap. And this is where economics enters the story again. If you owned hundreds of gladiators, feeding them steak every night would be an absurd expense. You wanted maximum calories for minimum cost. So a gladiator's diet could be thought of as fuel for a very expensive machine. The machine just happened to be a human being carrying a sword. And the better the fighter became, the more valuable he could become. But there was another strange feature of gladiator economics. A gladiator could earn money, at least in some circumstances. Successful gladiators could receive prizes after victories. They could also accumulate money from gifts, tips, or payments associated with their performances. And this money could become important because gladiators sometimes had something approaching personal wealth, even when they were legally enslaved. Imagine that. You might not legally own yourself, but you could potentially possess money. That creates one of the strangest contradictions in Roman society. A gladiator could be socially disgraced, yet economically valuable, and sometimes extremely famous. The Roman public didn't just watch anonymous fighters. They followed particular gladiators. They knew their names. They recognized their fighting styles. They chose favorites. In other words, gladiators could become celebrities. And celebrity has economic value. A famous gladiator could attract more attention to an event. More attention meant more prestige for the organizer. And more prestige could translate into political influence. This is why the person paying for the games mattered so much. Roman games were often sponsored by wealthy elites or politicians. At first glance, spending enormous amounts of money on public entertainment seems financially insane. Why would someone spend a fortune feeding thousands of people and putting on expensive fights? Because the return wasn't always measured in money. It was measured in popularity. Imagine you are a Roman politician. You want people to remember your name. You want the public to see you as generous. You want political allies. You want influence. So you organize an enormous spectacle. You bring in gladiators. You fill the arena. You provide food. You create excitement. And suddenly, tens of thousands of people associate your name with one of the most spectacular days of their lives. The games were essentially political advertising. Except instead of buying a billboard, You built an arena. And the Gladiator was one of the most important pieces of that advertising machine. But there was a major financial problem. Gladiators were dangerous investments. Every fight carried a risk. If your best fighter died, you didn't just lose a person. You lost years of training. You lost future victories. You lost potential prize money. And you lost the ability to use that fighter as part of future spectacles. So the economics of gladiatorial combat created an interesting incentive. Keep the gladiator alive. This is one reason the popular image of every gladiator fight ending with a dead body is misleading. Not every fight was a fight to the death. Experienced gladiators were valuable. If two skilled fighters could put on an exciting battle and both survive, the owner could potentially profit from them again. It was better business. And that brings us to one of the most important questions. How much could a gladiator actually make? There wasn't one universal salary. Their economic situation varied enormously depending on their status, owner, popularity, victories, and circumstances. A beginner had little bargaining power. A famous veteran had much more value. And a superstar could become a completely different economic category. Think about modern professional athletes. A random player isn't worth the same as a superstar who fills stadiums. The same basic economic principle could apply in the arena. Skill creates scarcity. If there were thousands of ordinary fighters but only a handful of exceptional ones, the exceptional fighters became extremely valuable. And that value could sometimes give them opportunities that ordinary slaves didn't have. The most famous possibility was freedom. A gladiator could potentially receive a wooden sword called a rudis. Receiving the rudis symbolized liberation from gladiatorial combat. After that, a freed gladiator became a freedman. And for someone who had spent years fighting for survival, freedom was worth more than any purse. But here's where the story gets even stranger. Some freed gladiators didn't simply disappear. They continued working around the gladiatorial world. Some became trainers. Some became instructors. Some may have continued participating in the arena voluntarily. Why? Because once you possessed a valuable skill, you could potentially earn money from it. Imagine spending years learning how to survive fights, then finally becoming free. You now possess something that very few people understand. You know how to fight. You know how gladiators train. You understand the arena. You have experience. Your body has become a resume, and that knowledge could be worth something. But there was still a massive economic hierarchy. At the top were the people organizing and financing the spectacle. Below them were the owners and trainers. Then came the fighters. And beneath the glamour was an enormous support economy. Blacksmiths produced weapons. Leather workers made equipment. Farmers produced food. Merchants transported supplies. Builders maintained arenas. Doctors treated injuries. Entertainers performed between events. Workers cleaned the facilities. Thousands of people could make a living because gladiatorial games existed. The gladiator was only the visible part of the machine, and the machine was enormous. The Colosseum itself is perhaps the clearest example. Imagine filling an enormous amphitheater with tens of thousands of spectators. Every seat represents a potential economic transaction. Food, drinks, transportation, merchandise, betting, entertainment, political influence. The spectacle created an entire ecosystem of spending, and gladiators were the stars who made the ecosystem worth paying attention to. But what happened when a gladiator became extremely famous? Something fascinating could happen. The fighter himself could become a brand. People could admire him, talk about him, bet on him, collect stories about him. And sometimes women in Roman society were fascinated by gladiators despite their low social status. This created another contradiction. A man could be legally enslaved, while being more famous than many free citizens. That tells us something important about economics. Market value and social status aren't always the same thing. Rome considered gladiators dishonorable. Yet Rome also paid to watch them. Rome could look down on them while making some of them rich. Rome could treat them as property while turning them into celebrities. And that's perhaps the most fascinating part of the entire system. The gladiator wasn't simply a victim, and he wasn't simply an athlete. He was both a human being and an economic asset inside a huge entertainment industry. His body generated revenue. His victories generated publicity. His fame generated demand. And his survival protected the owner's investment. But the entire system depended on one thing: people wanting to watch. Without the audience, There was no business, no tickets, no political prestige, no reason for wealthy sponsors to spend enormous amounts of money, no reason to train hundreds of fighters, no reason to maintain the arenas. The economics of the gladiator ultimately came down to demand. Romans wanted spectacle, the elites wanted influence, the owners wanted profit, and the gladiators provided the performance. It was entertainment built around real human risk, and that risk was precisely what made it valuable. A gladiator walking into the arena wasn't just carrying a sword. He was carrying the economic expectations of an entire industry. His owner wanted a return on investment. The sponsor wanted a successful spectacle. The crowd wanted excitement. And the gladiator wanted to survive. If he won, his value could rise. If he became famous, his value could rise even further. If he survived long enough, he might earn money. And if he eventually received the rudis, he could walk away with something far more valuable: freedom. So, could a Roman gladiator become rich? Some certainly had opportunities to accumulate wealth and rewards that were extraordinary compared with their starting position. But the majority were never living the glamorous life that movies sometimes suggest. For most, the economics were brutally simple. They were investments. Their owners paid to keep them alive because dead gladiators stopped generating revenue. Their bodies were trained, fed, repaired, and sent back into the arena. Again, and again, and again, until they were defeated, or until they earned their freedom. And that's the strange economic legacy of the Roman gladiator. Rome didn't just build an industry around violence. It built an industry around attention. The Romans discovered something that modern entertainment companies understand very well. People will pay to watch something they care about. And the more emotionally invested they become, the more valuable the spectacle becomes. 2,000 years later, the technology has changed. The arena has changed. The weapons are gone. But the basic economics haven't disappeared. Attention is still valuable. Fame is still valuable. Entertainment is still a business. And the people who understand how to turn attention into money can build enormous industries around it. The Roman gladiator was simply one of the most brutal examples in history. Because in ancient Rome, the most valuable thing a fighter could own wasn't his sword. It was his ability to make people watch.